A symphony of iron and earth, dawn at Heartland in the spring of 1969 did not bring the warmth of a new beginning. It brought the cold chill of judgment. The frost rising from the deep, melting ice beneath the ground met the humid air, forming a thick mist that swallowed the withered corn stalks left over from the previous season. Within that ethereal space, the Thomas family barn emerged like a mausoleum of wood and rusted tin. Thomas stood before the wooden barn doors, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his frayed coat. He took a deep breath, feeling the sharp sting of the salt frost cutting into his lungs. This morning, the world outside was operating under a new set of rules, the rules of numbers, of dancing interest rates, and of polished tractors that cost a fortune. But here, within the boundaries of this farm, the only rule that remained was the loyalty between man, metal, and earth. The battle with the frozen iron. He pushed the door open. The dry hinges groaned like a warning. In the dim shadows, the 1950 Farmall emerged, silent and stubborn. It did not resemble a machine. It looked like a giant sealed in an endless hibernation. Thomas approached, each footfall on the cracked earth echoing with a dry thud. He placed his hand on the tractor's hood. The first sensation was a bone-chilling cold, the kind of frost-bitten iron that had allowed the brutal Midwest winter to seep into its very core. The past winter had brought more than just snow. It had brought white death to the machinery. The engine oil in the crankcase was no longer a lubricant. It had thickened, congealing like tar, locking every piston and gear into a single immobile mass. Thomas began the task his father used to call checking the pulse. He pulled a small tin can from his pocket containing engine oil that had been heating on the kitchen wood stove for an hour. His hands trembled not entirely from the sub-zero chill, but from the crushing weight of time. The clock was ticking toward the bank's opening hours, and the headlights from Sterling's car, the lurking bank manager, had begun to flicker on the distant road like the eyes of a predator. Careful and meticulous as a surgeon, Thomas poured hot oil drop by drop into the oil cups, bearings, and joints. He used a kerosene-soaked rag, rubbing the engine block vigorously to generate a faint hint of frictional heat. "Wake up, old friend," he whispered, his breath forming a white cloud around the engine. "The land is waiting, and my father is watching. We can't let them take this place just because of a frozen morning." He checked the water level in the radiator and tightened a loose bolt. Every movement was precise, but carried an underlying desperation. This tractor was all he had left to face a world filled with foreclosure contracts. The drama intensified as Thomas stepped to the front of the machine where the iron hand crank awaited. In an era where Miller and other neighbors needed only to turn a key to wake hundreds of horsepower, Thomas had to use his own blood and bone to dialogue with steel. He gripped the crank. The freezing metal immediately clung to his skin, a stinging sensation like a cold burn. Thomas stood firm, his feet planted in the soil like corn roots, channeling his entire weight into his right arm. The first turn, he strained. A dry, haunting shriek echoed from inside the combustion chamber. It was the sound of metal grinding against metal, without a protective oil film, a cry of agony from the heart of the cast iron. The crank moved less than a quarter turn before seizing. The engine remained as stubborn as 1,000-year-old rock, mocking the feeble strength of man. Thomas could hear his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the thick tar inside refused to let go of the pistons. Thomas did not stop. He took a deep breath, pouring all his resentment and pride into the next swing. The second turn, he pushed harder. This time, the piston moved half a cycle. But just as the compression reached its peak, the engine kicked back. A slight but powerful backfire slammed the crank in the opposite direction. The iron bar struck Thomas's palm, a shockwave jolting up to his shoulder, nearly snapping his wrist. Thomas stumbled back, dropping the crank into the mud. At that moment, The headlights of Sterling's car swept across the barn door, bright and merciless. Sterling stood there, the watch on his wrist ticking away the seconds. Every second of silence in the barn was a step backward for Thomas into the abyss of bankruptcy. Sterling didn't need violence. He only needed the silence of the Farmall to prove Thomas had failed. Thomas looked at his hands. They were beet red from the cold, bruised from the impact, and blackened with grease. He looked at the red iron mass before him. A moment of despair flickered, but then he remembered his father's words. The land is the honor of our family. A fire ignited in his veins, incinerating the cold and the fear. Thomas stepped back, picked up the crank, and wiped the mud off on his coat. He was no longer cranking with the strength of muscle. He was cranking with the soul of a man driven to the brink. He pressed his forehead against the cold hood for one final second, then threw his entire body weight into the decisive turn. The third turn? Thomas let out a roar that tore through the morning silence. The crank moved slowly, then faster. The compression groaned, and then, boom! A thunderous, violent explosion erupted like a grenade in the confined space. The tin roof of the barn rattled violently, and dust fell from the wooden rafters like rain. From the vertical exhaust, a plume of thick, acrid black smoke shot straight into the sky like a signal flare for war. The Farmall shuddered violently. The entire frame vibrated under the power of thermonuclear explosions within the cast-iron chambers. The four-cylinder fire was rhythmic at first, halting like the breath of someone waking from a deep coma, but within seconds, it became crisp, steady, and steely. Clack boom, clack boom, clack boom. That sound wasn't just an engine. It was a symphony of defiance. It drowned out the wind whistling through the door, pushed back Sterling's ghost outside, and announced to the entire Heartland Valley, Thomas is still here. Thomas stood there, amidst the thick smoke, his face smeared with soot, but his eyes burning with a mad pride. He had awakened the giant. He had won the first battle in the war to keep his ancestors' land. The prelude was over, and now the symphony of iron and earth truly began on the fields awaiting the footprints of a free man. Facing the ghost of destiny, the Farmall's engine had now stabilized, crisp, rhythmic, and steady, like the heartbeat of a resurrected steel giant. The sound echoed throughout the barn, dispelling the gloomy stillness and bringing a new surge of life. Thomas breathed a sigh of relief, but there wasn't a single moment to relax. This was only the beginning. He leaped onto the freezing iron seat, feeling every vibration of the machine pulse through his body. The steering wheel was bare, without power steering, as unyielding as his own will. Thomas pulled the gear lever. A dry clack sounded as the gears mached. The Farmall began to roll heavy and slow-moving toward the wide-open barn doors. As the tractor slowly crawled out of the darkness, the first thing to emerge was the Farmall's pale, weak yellow headlights cutting into the thick mist. Then came the massive, deep red frame covered in rust. Thomas sat at the helm, his silhouette etched against the pitch-black smoke of the exhaust, looking like an earth god riding an ancient monster. But as soon as the Farmall cleared the barn, two other blinding beams of light suddenly swept in, tearing through the fog. They were the headlights from Miller's polished John Deere 4020, already idling just yards away, and the headlights of the black sedan belonging to Sterling from the bank. Miller sat atop his lush green John Deere, his brand-new cowboy hat tilted slightly, a mocking smirk plastered on his face. Beside the John Deere, Sterling leaned against his car door, arms crossed, his gaze cold enough to pierce through Thomas and his Farmall. Sterling said nothing, but his eyes spoke volumes. "I've been waiting for this moment, Thomas. Now, let's see what you can do with that pile of scrap metal." Just as Thomas prepared to throttle up and pass, the Farmall suddenly lurched. The engine let out a strange groan, and then faded out as thick black smoke billowed, completely obscuring his vision. A deathly silence fell over the yard. Miller burst into laughter, his voice carrying through the glass of his cabin. "It's dead, Thomas. Go sell it for scrap and sign Sterling's papers to be done with it." Sterling stepped forward leisurely, each footfall on the earth hitting like a hammer, driving a nail into the farm's coffin. He stopped right at the nose of the tractor and patted the rusted hood. "Look at that. Even your machine has more sense than its master. It's given up. Sign here, and you can go back to sleep." He held up a stack of white documents under the headlights, blocking Thomas's path. Thomas didn't utter a word. He closed his eyes, his hands gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He felt the heat radiating from the engine block, a strange spiritual connection. "Not this time," he whispered. He shoved the throttle to the maximum and slammed the clutch. Thoom! The Farmall spat a lick of fire from the exhaust, and the engine erupted more violently than ever before. The force was so sudden, it sent Sterling stumbling backward, his documents scattering into the misty wind. Thomas didn't turn back to look at Sterling, scrambling to get up from the mud. He stared straight at Miller. The John Deere's headlights shone directly into Thomas's face, highlighting the streaks of grease and soot on his cheeks, but they also illuminated eyes that were steadfast and unwavering. Miller gave a slight rev, the 4020's engine growling proudly. He said nothing, only shook his head in contempt. Thomas didn't respond either. He simply shifted gears, making the Farmall shudder. The Farmall's engine roared in a final note of defiance, announcing its presence. Thomas released the clutch, and the Farmall began to inch forward, its heavy iron wheels crushing the frost and grinding Sterling's loan documents deep into the mud. He drove the Farmall straight between the two beams of light, nearly grazing Miller's polished wheels. It was an uncompromising declaration of war. As the tractor passed through the light, the figures of Thomas and the Farmall once again vanished into the mist, leaving only the steady thrum of the engine echoing as they headed toward the field still shrouded in darkness. Miller watched them go, the smirk on his lips slowly fading. He felt a creeping sense of unease. He had the most modern machine. He had the backing of the bank. But why did the lonely silhouette of Thomas make him feel so unsettled? Sterling stood up, brushing mud off his expensive suit, his face purple with rage. He stared at Thomas's retreating back, then turned to Miller with a cold, hard expression. "Sterling," his voice trembling with anger, "he'll fail, Miller. Heartland soil will swallow him, and that iron carcass whole. His debt is almost due, and I won't overlook a single cent." Miller didn't answer. He knew Sterling was logically right, but he couldn't shake the haunting image of Thomas's eyes, the eyes of a man who had bet his life on every revolution of a piston. The real battle had only just begun. Struggle on the field of death. The early morning mist had not yet dissipated when the true battle erupted. As Thomas steered the 1950 Farmall out of the barn, he was not merely entering a new planting season. He was entering a siege where the enemies were both relentless nature and cold financial institutions. Heartland's fields this morning were no longer the gentle stretches of land found in the memories of bountiful harvests. The torrential rain that had lasted throughout the night had transformed the fertile soil into a muddy battlefield. The low-lying areas, typically the richest soil, had now become traps of thick black mire, ready to swallow anything that dared to venture near. Thomas stopped the machine at the eastern edge of the farm. The wind whistled past his ears, carrying a bone-chilling cold and the heavy scent of wet earth. He took a deep breath, his calloused hands gripping the bare iron steering wheel. Before him lay 80 acres of topsoil, and that was all that stood between him and bankruptcy. Thomas shifted gears, the sound of metal clashing harshly. The Farmall trudged into the first furrow. As its spindly iron wheels touched the slushy mud, Thomas lowered the plow lever. Screech! The tempered steel plowshare tore through the sod, plunging deep into the earth. But instead of churning over loose soil, the tractor suddenly bucked as if it had struck an invisible stone wall. The 4-cylinder engine, which had been purring rhythmically, suddenly shifted into a heavy, agonizing groan. Beneath the chassis, the iron wheels began to spin fruitlessly in place. The iron lugs of the wheels slashed violently into the muck, hurled chunks of black mud high into the air, splattering directly onto Thomas's face, chest, and his frayed old coat. The smell of damp earth mingled with the acrid scent of burnt oil surged into his nostrils. The Farmall began to sink. The weight of the heavy iron mass was becoming its own enemy as the mud rose to the wheel axles. Less than 100 yards away, on the other side of the boundary fence, a completely different reality was unfolding. Miller's John Deere 4020, a mobile fortress of late 60s technology, glided by haughtily. With its 4-wheel drive and massive high-traction rubber tires, it did not hesitate before the mire. Miller sat perched in his soundproof cabin, cigarette smoke wafting gently from his lips, mingling with the country music playing from the radio. Through the clean windshield, Miller looked over at Thomas. A mocking smirk appeared on his fleshy face. He revved the engine, and the John Deere surged forward, leaving behind a perfectly straight line of soil, as if to taunt the helplessness of his poor neighbor. Thomas did not look back. He had no time for envy, nor the mental capacity to dwell on Miller's contempt. His entire world was now narrowed down to the space between the driver's seat and the nose of the tractor. He knew that if he stopped now, the machine would sink deeper, and he would have to call for a tow, which meant Sterling would appear with a foreclosure contract immediately. "You will not go down now," Thomas screamed, his voice swallowed by the roar of the engine. He shifted the lever to low range, channeling the full power of the transmission to the 2 rear wheels. Thomas's hands strained, the muscles in his arms bulging and tightening like steel cables. The steering wheel, lacking power assist, vibrated violently, bucking back and forth like a wild beast trying to wrench itself free from a trap. Thomas had to use every ounce of his strength to keep the machine from being whipped off course by the mud. Black smoke billowed from the vertical exhaust, coiling into thick plumes under the mist. The Farmall engine shrieked in high-pitched, extreme notes. The heat radiating from the engine block was sweltering, blasting against Thomas's legs and making him feel as though he were sitting atop a volcano. And then, a mechanical miracle occurred. After digging through the slush, the iron lugs of the Farmall's wheels finally struck the hard-pan soil beneath. The tractor shuddered, and the engine's tone suddenly shifted from a groan back to a commanding roar. The Farmall began to inch forward, inch by inch. Every foot gained was a breathtaking victory. The rear plow began to function again, overturning glossy, fertile black clods, the black gold of Heartland. Thomas released the clutch and throttled up. The Farmall, battered and trembling but resolute, forged ahead. Sweat mingled with mud flowed down Thomas's face, stinging his eyes. But within his heart, a strange exhilaration was rising. He looked down at the planter, rhythmically dropping corn seeds into the warm earth. To Thomas, each of those seeds was not just a crop. They were bullets fired directly at his indebted destiny, at Sterling's cruel interest rates, and at Miller's arrogance. The John Deere's headlights from the other side still shone over, but Thomas found them dim and insignificant. He preferred this feeling, the freezing wind biting his face, the smell of grease splattered on his clothes, and the steely explosions ringing in his ears. This was the most direct communication between man and labor, unfiltered by soundproof glass or power steering. He panted, his chest heaving in sync with the pistons. In the middle of the field of death, Thomas muttered a manifesto that his ancestors had likely said when they first broke this land. "You eat dirt, I eat corn, we own no one." Those words acted like a shot of adrenaline. Thomas felt that his aging tractor was no longer a pile of scrap metal. It was a part of his body, his arm, his will. The 1950 Farmall, with all its coarseness and obsolescence, was composing a heroic symphony of free labor. For the next 14 hours, Thomas did not stop. When Miller's modern tractors had to retreat because their hydraulic systems were overloaded by the heavy mud, Thomas's Farmall kept trudging on. It had no complex systems to fail. It had only iron, oil, and a driver who did not know the word surrender. Not until the sun was a mere streak of crimson on the horizon did Thomas finally stop the machine at the end of the last furrow of the day. His body was spent, his hands swollen and trembling so much he could not close them. But looking back at the 80 acres of perfectly turned and seeded earth, Thomas smiled through the crust of dried mud on his face. The symphony of iron and earth had concluded its first chapter. Thomas owed no one an explanation, and he owed the bank no bow of the head. He had won the most important battle, the battle to be the master of himself on the land of his forefathers. The perfect ensemble of the winter, as the final streak of sunlight from the first day of seeding gradually dissolved into the horizon, the Heartland Valley donned a brilliant and violent shade of crimson. The twilight was not gentle as usual. It stained the newly overturned furrows deep red, making the entire field look like a battlefield where the gunfire had just ceased, with mist and dust still lingering over the trenches. At the center of that battlefield, Thomas stopped his machine at the final point of the very last field. The symphony of iron and earth had reached its final notes, leaving behind an echo that shook the soul. Thomas sat motionless on the driver's seat, his hands still gripping the wheel, as if fearing that if he let go, this reality would vanish. His entire body was spent, every fiber of muscle groaning under the pressure of 14 hours of hard labor. His shoulders were raw and bleeding, his thin shirt torn by the constant friction against the rugged iron seat and the violent jolts as the machine traversed old tree stumps. Worst of all were his hands. They were swollen, beet red, and filled with deep cracks from the freezing wind and mud. His knuckles were so stiff, he could not close them into a fist. Black grease was embedded deep within every line of his palms, turning them into a map of endurance. Yet, amidst that searing pain, Thomas felt a strange serenity. The pain of free labor was a form of power that those sitting in air-conditioned cabins could never understand. He turned his head to look back. A miracle emerged under the amber light of dusk. 80 acres of topsoil had been overturned, straight and orderly like the lines on a fresh sheet of paper. Every seed lay silent beneath the warm earth, ready for a resurrection. And then his gaze stopped at a point across the fence. A few hundred yards away, Miller's magnificent John Deere 4020 sat dead in its tracks in the middle of the field. That green giant, with all its advancement and arrogance, was now nothing more than a useless hunk of metal. An electronic circuit board, a sophisticated but fragile brain, had short-circuited due to the moisture from last night's rain. Miller stood beside it, scratching his head in frustration, helplessly watching the falling darkness. Modernity had collapsed before the whims of Mother Nature, while Thomas's scrap metal continued to roar rhythmically until the very last minute. Thomas leaned forward to cut the engine. A metallic sigh escaped, and then everything plunged into sudden silence. That stillness did not feel like death. It carried the solemnity of a cathedral after a service. In that space, only the steady tick-tick of the cooling engine block remained. To Thomas, those were the final notes, slender yet authoritative, of a heroic symphony. It was the sound of victory. He slowly climbed down from the driver's seat. As his feet touched the newly sown earth, Thomas fell to his knees. He did not kneel out of exhaustion, but as a rite of thanksgiving. He plunged his bloodied hands into the soft soil. The earth was no longer cold. It carried the warmth of hope, a warmth that flowed through the wounds on his hands like a miraculous painkiller. He picked up a handful of soil, bringing it to his nose to inhale the rich, musky scent of life. He let the loose earth slip through his fingers, falling back into the bosom of the motherland. Thomas understood that the first day of the season had ended not only in the glory of the harvest to come, but in the glory of character. That day, Thomas had not only won a bet against harsh nature or deep mire, he had won the most important wager of his life, the wager against the fear and frailty within his own soul. He had proven to Sterling, to Miller, and to the entire valley that legacy does not reside in the numbers of a bank ledger, but in the strength of those who dare to live and die on their own land without borrowing their self-respect from anyone. That night, Heartland sank into a deep sleep under a starry sky. The fields lay silent, waiting for green sprouts to emerge. Yet, in the wind whistling through the barn door cracks, one could still hear the distant echo of a 1950 Farmall. It was no hallucination. It was the resonance of an iron wheel vibrating through space. That echo served as a steely reminder to anyone who still doubted. In the long war between man and fate, it is not the one with the most expensive, flashiest machinery who wins. The one who remains at the end, the one who smiles under the sunset with bloodied hands, is always the one with the iron will and a completely free soul. Thomas lay in bed, his hands still throbbing, but a faint smile touched his lips. Outside the window, the Farmall stood in the darkness, silently guarding the seeds. The symphony had ended, but its melody, the melody of iron, of earth, and of human dignity, would echo forever through the corn seasons, like an immortal legend of the heartland. The Symphony of Iron and Earth is more than just a story about agriculture or machinery. It's a hymn to perseverance, the power of free labor, and the men who risk their lives with every turn of the piston to protect their ancestral heritage. If you love cinematic storytelling with its profound and meaningful messages, please subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Like and share if this story inspired you today. Comment, which scene moved you the most? Share your thoughts below.